Welcome everybody, welcome back to class. I would like to introduce a new method which is used in the controlling of banks, and it's called the layer method. The idea is that the balance sheet is distributed in three different parts, like short-term assets and liabilities, medium-term assets and liabilities, as well as long-term assets and liabilities. It is the case that here is some cash and bonds. These are like short-term assets. Consumer credit is a medium-term asset, and then there are also some other consumer credits which have a long-term maturity. So you can see the interest rates in brackets here and the volume to the right. With respect to the liability side, it's the case that in this bank balance sheet there are only short-term liabilities. And hence, to some extent, we have to make an assumption with respect to the liability side. And these assumptions are made on the next slide. So it is the case that we are assuming that we can use 10% of the current account balance, 10% of the time deposits, and 60% of the saving deposits to finance long-term assets. Furthermore, it is the case that we can use 60% of the current accounts and 60% of the time deposits, as well as 20% of the saving deposits to finance medium-term assets. And with respect to the short part, it is the case that we are assuming that we can use 30% of the current account deposits and the time deposits, as well as 20% of the saving deposits to finance short-term assets. So it seems to be the case that the degree of liquidity is assumed to be different with respect to current accounts and saving deposits. Of course, it is the case that at the beginning of the month, everybody gets the salary, like the private households, they get the salary, and hence over the month the private household is spending for rent, for food, for the car, and so on, so that at the end of the month the current account will be equal to zero, like all the liquidity will be gone. Therefore, there is a higher volatility on these current accounts, but this does not imply that this amount of money is gone, because when a private household is, for example, paying the rent, then it is the case that the money will end up on a different current account. So it's not leaving the whole banking sector. Sometimes when the person who is owning their apartment has an account at the same bank, then it will be the case that the private household is paying the rent to an account in the same bank. So it's not gone. This doesn't imply that we can't use these money on the current account to finance long-term assets, because it will stay within the bank, or at least within the banking sector. Nevertheless, the degree of volatility is definitely higher compared to saving deposits, and therefore the percentage points with respect to current account is lower compared to the saving deposits. Okay, let's have a look how we proceed afterwards. It is the case that we start with the first layer, the long term. And here it is the case that we have consumer credits of 200 on the asset side, and the interest rate is 9%. We are allowed to use 10% of the volume of the current accounts, 10% of the volume of the time deposits, and 60% of the volume of the savings to finance the first layer. So in the end, it is the case that there are 250 units of liabilities in layer 1, and hence we have to compute the average interest rate, the weighted average interest rate for the first layer. So we are computing the weighted average interest rate for the first layer, and we are doing so by computing the liabilities. So this upper index indicates Roman 1 for the first layer, and this little l here indicates liabilities. So let's compute this weighted average for the interest rate on the liabilities. The 20 times the 0.5, 50 times 6%, 180 times 5%, and then we divide by the sum of 250. So we get an average interest rate of 4.84%. Therefore, the overall profit margin for the first layer is equal to, like the 9% given from the assets, 9%, minus the weighted average interest rate for the liabilities, which is 4.84. So we get here an interest rate of 4.16%. The excess liquidity of layer 1 goes to layer 2. So we have 250 on the liability side, but we only need 200 to finance the long-term assets. So 50 units, they go at the weighted average interest rate of 4.84% to layer 2. Let's have a look at the layer 2, like the medium-term assets and liabilities. With respect to the assets, we have 500 volume of consumer credits in the medium-term assets at an interest rate of 9%. The liabilities is that consists out of the following items: current account to 60%, time deposits to 60%, savings to 20%, and the excess from layer 1, which was a volume of 50, goes into the second layer completely. Therefore, we have a 1 here. Let's compute the volume times this kind of rate here. We get these times this amount of volumes, and then we once more have to compute a weighted average interest rate for the liabilities for layer 2. So once more, 120 times 0.5, 300 times 6%, 60 times 5, 50 times 4.84%, and then we sum up and divide by 530. So we get the weighted average interest rate of the liabilities for the second layer. So the overall profit margin for the second layer is given by the interest rate on the asset side minus the weighted average interest rate for the second layer of liabilities, 9% minus 4.53%. This is the overall profit margin for the second layer. The excess liquidity of layer 2 goes to layer 3. So the excess liquidity here is 30 units. So 30 units of volume go at this interest rate to layer 3. Then we have the following short-term assets. We have cash and bonds. These are the interest rates. And we finance this stuff by these kind of liabilities, current accounts, according to the rule, which says 30%. Time deposits also 30%, savings with 20%, and the excess of layer 2 with 100%. So we get these volumes here times by we get these volumes here. This is the result by multiplying through this volume and these rates. And then we have to compute a weighted average interest rate for the liabilities, which is once more the 60 times 0.5, 150 times 6%, 60 times 5%, and 30, 4.47%. So we get here a weighted average interest rate for the liabilities in the third layer, which is 4.55%. We also have to compute a weighted average interest rate for the asset side, because for the first time here we have two different assets, and hence we also have to compute a weighted average interest rate here. In the end, we compute the overall profit margin in the following way. The weighted average interest rate for the assets of layer 3 minus the weighted average interest rate of the layer 3 for the liabilities gives an overall profit margin equal to 0.78. Afterwards, it is the case that we have computed like all the profit margins, and then we can combine the layer method with either the pooling method 1 or the pooling method 2. So we use the layer method so that we can compute the overall profit margin. In the end, we have to once more apply pooling method 1 or pooling method 2. So I think that the last method is very important, the market interest rate method. This seems to be the most elaborated method for the internal accounting. I would like to motivate this kind of method by once more going back to our initial balance sheet, where we have this amount of volumes of assets on the left-hand side and this amount of liabilities on the right-hand side. Once more, we can have a look at external accounting, and then we get here like the overall profit. I think that you are already familiar with this numerical example. What is very important here is that the money market rate is equal to 5%. So it's a case that all the different assets and all the different liabilities, they are always between the bank and the private customer or like a company. The only interest rate which is a market rate is the money market rate. And hence the idea is that we use the money market rate to compute the profitability of each position of the assets and of each position of the liabilities. Let's do so. So for example, the automotive credit interest rate is 10.5%. We subtract the money market rate of 5%, and then we get here the profitability of the automotive credit market as 5.5%. So the idea is that we are using the money market to buy the liquidity. Like we are using the money market to buy the liquidity so that we can give an automotive credit market in the end. And hence, like this difference between the automotive credit interest rate and the money market rate is an important relationship. This determines the profitability per unit of automotive credit. When we now multiply through the volume and this profit margin, we get the contribution to the overall profit. Same idea with consumer credit. So we are assuming that we are buying liquidity at the money market rate of 5%, and we are selling this liquidity at the interest rate of 13.5%. So the profit margin here is even higher, and also here we have to multiply through the volume times the profit margin so that we get the contribution to the profit. Same with respect to housing. On the liability side, the idea is that, for example, with respect to savings, we are getting liquidity from private households which are saving with our bank at the interest rate of 3%. So we get this volume of 20 units at the interest rate of 3%, but we could sell the liquidity at a money market rate of 5%. So the profit margin for the savings is equal to the difference between 5 and 3, so 2%. When we multiply through the volume times this profit margin, we get the profitability of the savings. Also, with respect to the time deposits, it's a case that the bank receives the liquidity from private households or companies at the interest rate of 3.5%, but they can sell the liquidity at the money market of 5%. So here the profit margin is 1.5%, and this is the contribution to profit, the volume times the profit margin. So the market interest rate method, I think, is very interesting because of the fact that the money market is regarded to be a kind of clearing house, a clearing system where we clear all liabilities. We are evaluating the profitability of all liabilities against the money market, and we are also evaluating the profitability of all assets against the money market. So this is the main idea of the market interest rate method, that we should use the information from the market as a kind of neutral referee in order to find out whether the one or the other position in our balance sheet is profitable or whether this is not the case. There is like one complication when it comes to the real world, and the complication is that we not only have one money market rates, but we have a yield curve. On this slide you can see the yield curve in April 2020. So we call this kind of curve the yield curve. In this graph you have on the vertical axis the yield in percent, so the interest rate, and on the horizontal axis there is the maturity in years. This yield structure is called to be a normal yield curve. A normal yield curve because it's upward sloping, so that the interest rate for shorter deposits is lower compared to longer deposits. So when the yield curve is upward sloping, we call it a normal yield curve. What is of course not normal is that the interest rate on the vertical axis is negative. We have not seen that in the past. Like before the financial crisis broke out in 2008, 2009, we have never seen this before. So this is special insofar as the yield is negative, but the shape is called a normal shape because it's upward sloping. When I was teaching this course for the first time in 2018, it was at least the case that assets which have a maturity longer than 6 years would have a positive yield. Only assets which had a maturity smaller than 6 years had also a negative interest rate. But this looked completely different in the year 1986 when the textbook was written. In the year 1986, it was the case that there was also a normal upward sloping yield curve, but also the interest rates were positive. So the money market rate for 1-day deposit was at the level of 4.4%. For a 3-month deposit, the interest rate was at 4.5%. And at the longer end, for 10 years bonds, the interest rate was equal to 6.5%. Let's compare the term structure of interest rates for the three different points in time, and let's analyze what does it imply for the profitability of a bank. In normal times, it is the case that a bank can make profit by borrowing liquidity at the low money market rate and by buying a long-term bond. So when the bank is borrowing liquidity at the interest rate of 4.4% and is buying this 10-year bond, it is the case that the interest rate difference is equal to 2.1%. So when a bank borrows at the liquidity at the interest rate of 4.4% and afterwards sells the liquidity by buying this 10-year bond, the bank can make a margin of 2.1%. How does that look like in 2018? The 10-year interest rate is at the level of 0.4% and the short-term interest rate is at the level of minus 0.7%. So the margin between this negative 0.7 and the positive 0.4 is only 1.1%. So when the bank is buying liquidity at the short-term interest rate of minus 0.7% and is selling the liquidity at the interest rate of 0.4%, in 2018, the bank can only generate a profit margin of 1.1%. How does that look like in the year 2020? Let's go back to the slide. So here it is the case that for a 10-year bond, the interest rate is a negative 0.4. And once more, here we are at the lower end of the yield curve. So the difference is approximately equal to minus 0.4% for the long-term asset. And we have interest rate of minus 0.6% on the daily basis. So that here the profit margin is only 0.2%. So when we compare the situation in the year 2020 with the situation in 1986, the profit margin is much, much higher in 1986. It's 10 times higher compared to the situation before. When we compare the situation in 1986 and the situation in 2020, it's a case that in 1986, the profit margin was 10 times higher than today. It is very hard for the bank to make money on this game. We are borrowing liquidity short-term and we are investing in long-term assets because the yield curve is pretty flat. So this does not work out anymore. Nevertheless, I would like to go back to the textbook and work with the textbook example. So we were looking at this term structure of the interest rate, and based on this term structure of the interest rate, I would like to deduct the so-called term premium. The term premium is computed in the following way. I use the interest rate on each maturity, and we are subtracting the interest rate of the shortest maturity. So we are subtracting from each interest rate the value of 4.4%, and then we get to the term premium. So the term premium is of course 0 for the daily money market rate, but it's positive for the 3-month money market rate. 3-month money market interest rate is 4.5%. When we subtract the daily money market rate, we end up at a term premium of 0.1%. And at the long-term bond, the term premium is 2.1%. So the interest rate is 2.1% higher compared to the money market rate. In a first step, I would like to explain how we can use these insights for a bank which only has market operations. So this bank has no private customers in form of households or companies. This bank only operates at the money market. So in normal times, the bank can make a profit by getting liquidity from short-term liabilities or shorter-term liabilities and investing this liquidity in long-term assets. For example, here we have a bank. It has short-term liabilities, one-day liabilities or one-year liabilities, and this bank is investing in a 3-month money market instrument or a 10-year bond. So the idea once more is this bank is getting liquidity short-term at lower rates and is then buying longer-term assets at higher rates. So this bank takes advantage from this upward sloping yield curve and the positive term structure. Let's have a look at the profitability of this bank. Let's have a look at this table, which stems from the external accounting. You can see here in the upper part the revenues and in the lower part the cost. So this bank is profitable. When it comes to the internal accounting, it is very important that we remember that the daily money market rate is at the level of 4.4%, because we are evaluating the profitability of all balance sheet items against the money market rate. This is performed on slide number 37. The 3-month asset is profitable because of the fact that the bank receives a 4.5% interest and was buying this liquidity at the rate of 4.4%. So the profit margin is 0.1%. The long-term bond is even more profitable. The bank is receiving 6.5%, but the cost for the liquidity is only 4.4%, so the profit margin is higher. When it comes to the liability side, this is the profit margin on the daily money market rate is of course equal to 0, and the profit margin for the long-term bond is negative. And this indicates that the bank is buying liquidity at the interest rate of 4.6%, but could also use the money market to buy this liquidity. So here the profit margin is a negative 0.2%. Overall, you can see here that especially the long-term bond is the most profitable part of this bank. So the bank is generating a lot of profit from this long-term bond. Let's have a look at another bank. This bank is different. This is a bank which is only doing business with customers, and this bank has no market operations. So this bank is not operating at the money market. It's not operating at the bond market. So we are looking here at a bank which is financing its operation in the following way. It has some private customers. It offers current account. It offers time deposits, and then the bank is giving consumer credits or housing credits. A bank which is operating with real customers, so with private households or with companies, they of course have to charge higher interest rates compared to a bank which is just operating at the money market. Look here at the asset side. For example, here, this bank, which has some customers, is able to receive 5% for a 3-month product. This is different compared to the bank we looked before, which was only able to get 4.5% from the money market rate. Also, when we look at the balance sheet of a bank which has only private customers and companies, this bank is able to make 7.6% on a 10-year housing credit, compared to the other bank which was only able to generate 6.5% for a 10-year bond. This of course has to be the case, because this bank has to have some people which are checking the credit worthiness of the private households or the companies. And also these banks, they have to have offices where people are working, and hence it has to be the case that the interest rate on the asset side has to be higher. Also, the interest rate on the liability side should be lower. For example, here, the current account 1-day liabilities, they only cost 0.5% compared to the money market where the interest rate is 4.4%. And the long-term liabilities here, the bank is able to get long-term liabilities at the interest rate of 4% compared to the short-term bond market where the other bank has to pay 4.6%. Of course, it has to be the case that the interest rates on the liability sides have to be lower. Else, also this bank could go just to the money market and finance its operations by getting liquidity from the money market. So a bank which is really operating with private customers has to have a higher interest rate on the asset side and a lower interest rate on the liability side in order to break even, in order to generate the amount of profit necessary to pay wages for the employees and to pay the rent for the different offices. But then it is the case that to some extent the profitability of this bank depends on the term structure of the interest rate, and also it depends on how good the one or the other department is doing in selling consumer credits or in selling housing credits. In a first step, let's once more have a look at the external accounting. Let's check the revenues, which are given here, the costs, which is given here, and the profitability. So this bank is profitable. Let's have a look at the internal accounting. So we have to split up the profitability of this bank in two parts now. It is the case that to some extent this bank is profitable because of the fact that it is profiting from the normal slope of the yield curve, and to some extent this bank is profiting because of the fact that it is doing business with real customers instead of just using the money or the bond market. In the internal accounting, we try to split the profitability of each position into two parts. The first part is the part where we take into account that this bank is operating with real customers, so with private households and companies. And the second part should acknowledge the fact that the yield curve is upward sloping. So here it is the case that consumer credits have a 3-month maturity. The bank is earning an interest rate of 5%. In case that the bank would have sold this liquidity at the money market, it would have received only 4.5%. So the difference between the interest rate the bank earns on the consumer credit and the 3-month money market rate is due to the fact that the bank is making business with real customers. So this profit margin of 0.5% is due to the fact that the bank is making deals with real customers. Also, housing credits, 10 years. The bank is able to charge an interest rate of 7.6% in case that the central bank would have invested this liquidity at the bond market. The bank would only receive 6.5% interest. So this 1.1% difference is due to the fact that this bank is operating with real customers. In the second column, you can find the contribution to the profit due to the fact that this bank is taking advantage of the term structure of interest rates. So this bank could buy liquidity at the price of 4.4% on the daily money market rate, but this bank is investing at the 3-month horizon, so the bank is able to generate a profit margin of 0.1%. Also here, the bank could get liquidity at the interest rate of 4.4% at the daily rate, but is investing in a 10-year in an asset with 10-year maturity. So these 2.1 percentage points here is due to the fact that the bank would be able to borrow liquidity short term and is selling this liquidity at the very long term. In the last column, you can see the product of the volume times these kind of margins here. So for example, this 10, this stems from multiplying through the volume of 20 by this 0.5, and this 2 stems from multiplying through the volume with the 0.1. Also, the same calculations apply for the liability side. So this bank is able to get current account deposits at the interest rate of 0.5%. Instead, when the bank would use the money market, it would have to pay 4.4%. So the advantage due to the fact that this bank is operating with real customers is a 3.9%. Once more, like in the first column, you can see the contribution for the profitability of the bank due to the fact that the bank is operating with real customers, private households and companies. And in the second column, you can see the contribution to the profitability of the bank due to the fact that the bank is taking advantage of the upward sloping term structure of the interest rate. Hence, the overall profit of 448 units are to a very large extent due to the fact that we are talking here about a bank with real customers. So 290 units, they stem from the operation with real customers, and only 158 units due to the fact that the bank is taking advantage of the structure of the yield curve. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye bye.